Thank you for the introduction. I'm Dane Plaza, Director of Federal Operations at Bodie Technology. Today I'm going to talk about a rapid DNA program that we've been operating for the better part of 2 years, looking at preventing child trafficking on the southwest US border. So for rapid DNA, essentially is this paradigm shifting technology where we move the entire forensic DNA process out of a central laboratory into operators and the hands of people that need to run DNA, maybe in the field or a different location or other than a traditional forensic laboratory. It involves a simple step of taking either a piece of evidence or a swab from somebody's mouth, placing it inside of a cartridge into the machine and pressing go. In around 90 to 100 minutes, you then get your results back, where you can then do kinship comparisons, you can search databases, or do one-to-one comparisons from evidence to person of interest. So with having rapid DNA, and we also have this crisis along the southwest US border. Since around 2018, there's been a drastic rise of fraudulent family units attempting to cross the border. Essentially what the scheme is people pose to be families in hopes that they would get released as a family unit within the US border. Having children that may not be theirs whatsoever, they could then traffic or sell them from there, and that's where really this issue has taken place. Without DNA, they would just look at traditional birth certificates, look at documentation to try to determine, is this a true parent-child relationship, yes or no? That amount of investigation really has put a strain on all of the border resources that they could look at. So with having a rapid DNA solution and a problem along the southwest border, the U.S. government put out a request for bid on a contract, which we had successfully won, and married the two, the issue and the technological solution together. So we then began the process of getting rapid DNA deployed out to specific end users. We had to go through and train hundreds of personnel across the whole southwest US border at various locations of where we'd want to get rapid DNA set up. We would not just provide an instrument and say, okay, we'll see you in 2 years. We really had to look at developing a whole reachback portal and system to support these operators. This would include questions on sampling, questions on results, inconclusive result review, or any type of issue they'd have on a day-to-day basis that we could talk to in 24/7, 365 support. Beyond this training, we were talking about non-technical operators. So we had to start developing a training program to cover field agents and how they could actually run rapid DNA in the field. So a program of this scope, magnitude, and complexity, really there was a lot of operational challenges. Number one was the many different geographic sites that we had to cover. These were not sites that were right next to each other or even a couple miles apart. We're talking hundreds of miles apart between these sites. Each site has to be operated completely independently, meaning they couldn't just go borrow additional reagents, instruments, supplies. So we had to set up complete infrastructure for every single site independently, so they could not have to rely on each other and could operate by themselves without really any other type of support. One thing we noticed too is the variable configuration. So looking at types of rapid DNA instruments, the main reason we wanted to go with the rapid ID as a single run instrument is to account for variability from site to site. You may have some sites that you would not see a big migrant pattern where you could remove instruments and redeploy them to different areas that are having higher throughput. So having that single run flexibility and ability to move instruments from site to site was really key in order to meet the missions of the government. And also, as I mentioned, this had to be a fully self-sufficient capability. So the plan was we'd go, we'd train, we'd deploy our personnel there, get agents all set up to run, and then they could operate independently with us just serving as reachback from Virginia. Also, we had to address consumable supply chain. Like I mentioned, these are field forward sites, sometimes a ways away from any type of population centers. So making sure that they have all the, not only rapid DNA instruments and consumables they need, but any other support consumables or infrastructure had to be in place for each individual site. With that, we go to like IT, bio-waste communications. We essentially were given a shell of a building or whatever type of area we'd be working in, and power. So we had to develop our own IT and network solutions so we could communicate with the fields whenever needed. Data and privacy security was paramount as well. We did not want any type of transfer of DNA information from the sites to our location in Virginia. So a way that all the information would remain on site and encrypted. Finally, for support, I mentioned training, developing a training program, not only for the field personnel that be running it, but actually retraining our staff at our laboratory, different than dealing with other crime labs. You're dealing with operators in the field. So training our personnel on interactions and describing rapid DNA and DNA technology in a way that everybody be comfortable with. Our technical approach began with finding a rapid DNA vendor. Bodhi being a forensic DNA laboratory, we did not manufacture our own instruments, so we partnered with Thermo Fisher Scientific in order to get in place all the rapid DNA instruments and consumables we need for this project. We then had to look at sample collection. The sample collection kit that we had to design for this was a custom design kit in order to have the correct amount of sample documentation, barcode swabs that the client required. Then biohazard waste disposal. These being remote field sites, they did not have current biohazard capabilities. Obviously, any type of DNA swabs or swabs from the mouth would require proper biohazard. So we had to find a master vendor that could handle all the sites along the border to pick up our waste roughly around every 2 weeks. The training program was kind of the cornerstone, and I hit on this more and more in my talk, of developing a training program for the individuals. We noticed quickly that if individuals in the field that had no DNA background didn't fully understand the system, they may be scared to use it or kind of shy away from DNA. So getting a training program that agents could feel relatable to, get comfortable with the instruments and get comfortable with the results was really key. Also, as I mentioned before, training our own personnel on how to handle each of these individual sites and how to perform reachback support or other questions that may come from the field. Personnel, we had to staff personnel in the field to get the sites up, running, and training agents, and also a giant pool of reachback analysts. It was very rare that you could have an issue, on normal work days. A lot of times you could have a reachback request at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday. So making sure we had redundant coverage at our facility in Virginia that could handle any question from the field as it come in. Also, we had a dedicated technical lead and program manager that could handle not only questions from the field, but also from the main program office if questions did arise. So as I mentioned, partners are critical in launching a program like this. So we have Bodhi and Thermo as the partner on this, because rapid DNA we know is this paradigm shifting technology where you're getting DNA answers in under 2 hours. But it's not 100% lights out. We do know that running rapid DNA samples, you could have instances where there could be too low of a DNA collection. A lot of these people who are coming through at the border were dehydrated. So you could have samples where you'd have low DNA collection. Other times you just have a failed instrument run. It happens just with any type of forensic processing. So being able to have not only a provider, but a laboratory that could handle a lot of these questions was key. So the sample processing flow we used for this program begins running left to right. They would encounter a possible parent-child. They would get consent. They'd run the rapid DNA samples. If it goes to the top one and the samples would pass, we'd run the parentage determination in the software. If by some chance it would come out as inconclusive being less than 99.5% and greater than 0%, somewhere in that gray area, we would have our certified AABB personnel in our facility review the profile, see if there are any just minor mutations that you could determine if it was positive or negative for parentage. If by chance a sample ran and did not give a 100% lights out passing score, then we'd go ahead and log in and do that reachback support. Majority of the time we could determine that, hey, it's just a little blip in the sample or in the baseline. That sample can pass, it can proceed down to parentage. But there were those instances where it could have been a run issue or low DNA, where just the rapid DNA sample had failed. Then we would go back to the field and say, hey, you have to rerun the sample. We've done thousands of these type of reachback requests, typically within a couple of minutes. We got down to probably 3-4 minutes from the time a sample would be flagged to we'd have the result. Sometimes it could be a little bit longer if you had to look into it a little bit more. So how you'd actually run on the software, the Rapid Link software is a really easy to use piece of software, where as your rapid DNA results are generated on the left window there, they're dragged into a family tree. So for us, we drag the proposed parent into the top, then one of the proposed children at the bottom. Then you just generate your report. Single click report generation. You don't have to work on any type of statistics. It'll then spit out your report. The report we used was a customized report because they did not want a lot of additional DNA information being present on the report. So you could have it just be person A is this barcode, person B is this barcode, and here's the results for kinship. You give your percentage and your positive or negative for kinship. So in a perfect world, you have the small feedback loop of the left 3 circles here. You collect the sample, you'd run it within 90 minutes, and then you generate your report. If you did need the laboratory to look at it, they could quickly look at it and go from there. However, if you look at a bigger one where you were having questions, that having that feedback loop for a reachback center to answer any of the questions was important for this program. How you perform the reachback and the logistics that we set up was, first of all, developing the staff that we needed to perform reachback. All of the personnel we used or proficiency tested DNA analysts present in our lab in Virginia. They also have gone through a rapid training program to make sure they understood the rapid technology and are comfortable with providing reachback and also analyzing results. I mentioned we had AABB certified paternity experts that could look at any type of questions on the paternity scale. The 24/7, 365 availability was key because a lot of them would come in at odd hours and over the weekend. So having a large redundant pool of personnel that could handle this type of support needed on the program was important. We'd have sometimes 2, 3 people staffed in certain time frames with push notifications, text notifications, email notifications to a centralized line that would ping all the personnel that were on call. And then the first one that could grab it would go ahead and proceed with the support. In order to do a review of DNA profiles, there were several options we looked at. Number one would be exporting a file and emailing it back and forth. You could do set up secure FTP site transfers. But we end up doing an encrypted portal access where we would just log into the machines remotely, perform our reachback analysis, and then let them proceed to generate the reports that way. Therefore, you eliminated any type of email back and forth, file transfers, and any type of possible leaks for data security. So reachback, we quickly learned, is not just sitting back and waiting for the field to say, we have an issue, please look into it for us. Well, that is still a big key, is looking at profile review. We were a front line for instrument troubleshooting. The instruments performed phenomenally across all the different sites throughout the program, but sometimes you would get an error code or something that would fire on the instrument that said that you need somebody to look at it. We would be frontline instrument support before elevating it to Thermo Fisher to look at it, but that became a good chunk of reachback, is just trying to answer basic questions that way. Reviewing different reports, whether it be inconclusive or even describing what parentage reports meant, retraining individuals that had the training but kind of wanted a refresher on, okay, if it doesn't mean negative and it's 0%, what does that truly mean? So going through and being a support mechanism for them to describe the true DNA results was something we had quite often as well. Also, Bodhi being an accredited laboratory, we were set up for additional sample processing. This is an investigative tool. DNA is only part of what they used for their investigations. They still did look at birth records, did interviews. So DNA was a piece of the puzzle in their investigative processes. If they needed to move forward with additional testing for court admissibility, we were set up to handle their samples whenever they want to set it that way. And I mentioned the training. The training was really more and more, as we looked at it and progressed throughout the 26 months, a key aspect. Getting the agents more and more comfortable in using DNA and kind of building that foundation really yielded a great program. So what we do is we give them a basic DNA 101 introduction, get them familiar with technology and DNA terminology. We then have them go physically use all the instrumentation. They would observe one of us running DNA samples. We then have them run a practical set on their own and then a competency or almost proficiency test to certify that they were capable of doing this. We documented everything. We documented all the agents that got certified. From there as well, different agents will rotate in and out. So having a core person there, we've done train the trainer training where they have a centralized person that could give the DNA training to new agents coming through if by chance we were not in the field that week to support them. Then going into the world of COVID, when training really wasn't, training for travel was not available, virtual remote trainings that we provided in virtual support over Teams platforms, Skype, and trying to go through whole classes of new personnel from lectures all the way to practical observations. As I mentioned, building that intro to DNA 101 parentage as the kind of the base of your pyramid, and going up through being familiar with the sample, with the software, the instrumentation, QA/QC. A lot of it was a new term for most people, but just understanding how they could run controls, how they make sure that the instruments are running correctly, how everything comes off in terms of controls. Then they run their practical set, and then they would get certified in rapid DNA technology. So some of the issues that we encountered, number one, is probably the geographic logistics. I mentioned you may have remote sites in Texas versus Arizona versus Mexico and California. So trying to make sure that each of these sites were fully covered, not only with what they needed for operations, but backups, or if we needed to get something to them rapidly. A lot of times FedEx would not get there, in a timely fashion, being so remote. So that in kind of conjunction with dealing with varying site conditions, you'll see the following slide or a couple slides up, we range from a tent to a bus to a hardened plywood structure. So the varying site conditions we thought were really going to take a toll on instrumentation and results. So trying to overcome those and make sure that we were seeing constant results across all different sites. Expanding programs on the fly. I mentioned with the Rapid ID being a single sample instrument, we were easily able to move instruments that for sites that were not running very many samples, we could reallocate assets and instruments, move them across states. get them set up into either completely new sites or support other sites that were already running but needed additional throughput for additional instruments. So milestones of the program. This program ran for a little over 26 months. It recently ended. We established 13 independent field forward rapid DNA sites. That includes everything I mentioned before, including infrastructure, supplies, materials, support. You're setting up essentially little mini, almost laboratories at all these different sites. We provided over 8,500 hours of deployed analyst training. That includes setting up sites, training agents, supporting the program, any type of maintenance we need to do. So we did have a constant presence at a good chunk of the sites for the majority of the 26 months. In that time, we trained over 300 operators in rapid DNA technology and operation. On the right here, you'll see an example of the reports that we issued for this program. Very streamlined so that you could see person A, person B. They just have their barcode listed there, so there's no PII associated with the report. It would then spit out a probability of related and also a likelihood ratio, and then essentially a thumbs up, thumbs down for relationship. Is this negative or is this positive for parent-child? So I mentioned the varying site conditions. Here is a snapshot of some of the ones we looked at. That top left one is in a Connex box, more of a shipping container that has windows and doors. A lot of them were in hardened buildings, hardened structures, concrete cement buildings. Top right one was on an RV that we were on, or a centralized command bus. We were on there for a couple months until they got another site ready. As I mentioned before too, another one, we were in just a rough plywood enclosure inside of a tent, kind of in the middle of the field. So we really did expect, with all the variations on where it was and temperature and humidity, that we were going to see variations from site to site. We didn't. We tracked every sample that was run across programs, and we saw no difference between really even instrument to instrument or site to site. The plywood shack run compared to a hardened building, we still saw the same success rates. What was really surprising is, we were seeing better than a 94% first pass success rates on samples, and that counts all 7,000 plus we ran across all the sites. Those around 6% of failure was split about half and half. Half was usually too low of DNA template. I mentioned dehydration. A lot of them could be younger kids too that were swabbed very softly, so you wouldn't get enough DNA to run the instrument. And then 3% roughly would be just instrument, blip in the bottom on the baseline, or a failed ILS, something like that. So we had just over 7,000 runs in the program in the 26 months we ran. On the right, it kind of shows the total samples per site. You can see, the two on the far left being the surge sites. So those are the ones we saw the most migrant traffic and most testing out of. And then some of the smaller ones drop down. So you can see the great variation and therefore the need to have a technology you can move around and handle higher volumes at different sites. For reachback requests, we did around 1,400 reachback requests. That's not all just failed samples. That could just be general questions as well. Typically, it was all sub 14 minutes. I think those were most of our longer ones, but usually within 2 or 3 minutes, they'd have resolution from our lab in Virginia back down to the border. With that, of the 1,400, we had about 1,000 samples pass reachback. So you can think about the cost savings and support to ops tempo. You don't have to rerun a sample. If you could look at it within 5 minutes, you can say, hey, no, the sample actually does pass. You don't need to spend X amount of dollars and another 95 minutes to rerun the sample. It worked out to a little over 2 months of instrument runtime we saved just on being able to review samples as a reachback portal. Things were going along great. We were processing high level number of samples, and then COVID hit. You can see here by the charts, our peak when the program started going, we were running over 1,000 samples in a month. And then right around that February, March timeframe, migrant patterns changed, borders started closing, and the program didn't go completely quiet, but it went drastically down from 1,000 down to 2 samples in September 2020, really in peak COVID. Same thing, samples per day across the program. I think our high was around 65 samples. We did trend back up in 2021 as the program ramped back up until it ended in September of this year. So really the impact, we know what we're doing, we provide the technology. What did we really see? This program supported hundreds of arrests for child trafficking. I mentioned DNA is part of the investigation, but the DNA really proved in a lot of these where we were told that we were interviewing personnel, we thought the story was solid, and we ran the DNA and found negative. So it really was an impactful technology. And also served the other purpose as well of keeping families together. There were several instances where paperwork may have looked forged. The stories didn't seem like they're jiving. Most likely they were going to be separated, but then they run the DNA and prove no, they are a true parent-child relationship. So then the families could stay together and move forward. We also found out that it was serving as a deterrent. As people were getting rolled up, they said, well, we know we're going to get caught with DNA, so they confess. Also, the presence of the capability. You'd hear people coming through the border saying that, well, we know rapid DNA technology or DNA is here, so we're not even going to try to bring kids or try to traffic kids through this area because we know we're going to get caught at the point of entry. So a couple examples of some DNA supported investigations. The first one was a 24-year-old bringing over a 6-month-old son. They noticed some discrepancies in the paperwork, got consent, took DNA samples. After the DNA resulted as a negative, subject said, no, the child belonged to my girlfriend. When questioned further, he kind of went through, well, I don't remember her name or where she is, so the story kind of fell apart from there. They did find out then that this suspect actually tried to enter with this child 2 separate occasions in different border crossing to try to get him over and smuggle or traffic him from there. Another one, something similar, a female coming over with an 8-year-old son, questioned the validity of their documents, took DNA swabs, and then she admitted, no, she's not related to the child. She borrowed it from a friend, child's mother. The mother gave her the fraudulent certificate. They tried to track down the actual mother. It was, well, I don't remember where she was, kind of the same thing where, these kids are purchased or, borrowed out of countries to try to smuggle in. And then once they are found that they're lying, the story kind of falls apart from there. So some of the key lessons we've learned, rapid DNA program and rapid DNA is more than just an instrument. You really need, not only the instrument, but you need that support system lined up to help you with training, with review, with anything that might pop up. So you can't just plop an instrument there and say you're good. You really need that support system. Buy-in from operators and from management is important. If you don't have the backing of the people actually running it or behind the program, this instance we had both, and people were really invested once they learned about rapid DNA and the impact, and saw the impact it was having. We definitely got buy-in, which made it a successful program. If you're deploying to multiple different locations, you're going to see site-to-site variation. That's to be expected, but with proper mitigation, you shouldn't see any really change in your results. For our reachback team, we learned back here that depth is really key. Having 2-3 people per time slot in case somebody wasn't available was important to make sure you had that coverage, because the last thing you wanted is the client to be waiting for results and nobody's answering them no matter what time of day it is. So having those open lines of communication with the field at all times and they feel comfortable enough to reach out to you with questions was important. Also, another thing we learned is don't get tied into a certain technical approach. If you're set, we're going to use this type of hardware, this type of software, we're not going to change. We definitely had to adapt a lot of our techniques and our policies and procedures as we went forward to kind of see what would fit the best mission set. With this planning and partnerships, the Bodhi Thermal partnership on this proved to be invaluable because them as the provider and supporting all their instrumentation and us as the laboratory really gelled well together to provide the government the best value and all the services they needed really expediently as well. So rapid DNA obviously can be used more than just what we did for this border program. Investigative leads testing, you could have it at your police agencies or mobile crime scenes and be going out and doing lead testing that way. And DVI is always in the news, so being able to identify mass disaster victims in a timely manner with rapid DNA is another possibility. Booking stations are coming along now in the US, so getting rapid DNA systems in the booking station so they can run DNA at point of arrest. And then additional border control, unaccompanied minor databasing, familiar relationships like we have here, or even ID verification beyond just normal IDs. If you have somebody databased to verify that their DNA matches what's in the database, you can do that as well. I thank you for your time, and I can take any questions from there.